Thank you all for being here, first panel of the morning, and thank you to the three panelists. So as Kirsten just said, to a large extent, space tech is defense tech, given that the US government and the DoD remain the largest buyers of space technology in the United States. Tim, I want to throw a stat out to you, and I want to get your reaction. The Wall Street Journal reported that in the last fiscal year, startups got less than 1% of the DoD's $411 billion contracts. Of course, $4 billion is nothing to turn your nose up at, but what they also found was that this wasn't much higher of a percentage than a decade ago. Are you surprised by that?
I'm not. What I would say, though, as we look at incoming administrations and the amount of time that we spend at the policy level, at the legislative level, there's an understanding that the United States has a responsibility as well as an opportunity to continue to maintain the lead in the space sector. It is a highly contested domain, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about that. It's one of the reasons that we love the intersection between technology and defense, but that the funding and the focus has to shift dramatically in order to support the demand curve that is already in existence.
Mm-hmm. Deborah, I want to talk to you. Do you feel like there is still, what kind of changes have you seen within the DoD in terms of their willingness to work with startups over the same time period, say a decade?
Right. Well, so it's maybe not surprising that the funding situation hasn't changed, but the DoD over the last decade has really put together a number of innovation programs that are really focused on trying to accelerate the adoption of commercial for them. So just to name a few of those, the Defense Innovation Unit is one that's been focused on this. As well, the Office of Strategic Capital is really focused on trying to bring, that public-private partnership money together. And then just last week, there was an announcement of bringing 13 additional funds from the private sector there to bring in more money. And, just another example is the Air Force and Space Works is an example of really trying to help mature capabilities and technologies from companies. So I would say, even though we're still not seeing enough of the funding, I think there's a lot more of the mechanisms there that are trying to bring in commercial and accelerate that and help them to really break down some of the challenges around the regulatory and the testing. And, I'll just say that one of the things that Aerospace has been involved in has been the tech readiness level boot camp, and it's a way to help these new startup companies mature their technologies and advance. So I think these are just some of the types of innovation programs the DoD has put in place.
Just a quick follow-up. It seems to me like many of those programs, though, are focused on the early stages, and startups, once they hit maybe Series B and later, are finding less opportunity. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do think that has been some of the challenge, although I would say, we've heard a lot about these programs now and some of the front doors and commercial space programs having these front door programs. And again, that really does focus more on that front end. So I do think we are looking at a place where we need to really bring in more on those later stages. But I think some of the awards that we have seen in this space are actually getting larger. They're more substantial. I mean, 50K, 100K is not going to get a startup through the gates. But when you talk about some of the multi-million amounts of money there, then we're talking about real funding. And so I think some of these programs, these matching, the Office of Strategic Capital programs there, those are the things that I think are going to make that real difference. And, again, I think the tech readiness level boot camp is something that is really focused on bringing and building trust later in the phases there.
Mm-hmm. Evan, one way to look at like a dual use strategy is as basically a hedge against maybe the DoD's maybe lack of speed in working with new companies. But I understand you sort of think the term is a bit silly. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the term is a little idiosyncratic of a time that has largely passed us, a time when space was not a contested domain. Anomaly was started because we saw that there was a large outflow of threat development, particularly coming out of Russia and China. And I think many space companies that were started kind of in the early 2000s and maybe in the 10s were focused on this emerging GeoInt type market. And that market really had two customers. The first is the kind of environmental monitoring type folks, and then the other was the defense side. And I think investors largely pushed the dual use thesis, even though the defense market was starting to become like much more mature. And we think that the kind of the situation we find ourselves in with the maturity of a contested space domain requires some companies to sort of contend with the reality of threats. And we're totally focused on dealing with those threats, building the technologies, the hardware and the software that are required. Our investors largely have not pushed us in that direction because they recognize that there's this kind of interest in defense, that investors understand the thesis. They're no longer kind of arguing for a focus on dual use. They're arguing for, wow, there's actually really great economic gain to be had by focusing on defense completely. And so we've kind of set it aside, which makes us, I think, largely unique in the space community that has had this historic focus on dual use.
Yeah, I sometimes think that the real push of the dual use narrative, even in instances or technologies where there is no commercial market, but there's very clearly a defense market, I sometimes wonder if it is a story that they can sell to LPs who are maybe a little nervous about going all in on a pure play defense company. Do you agree? I sometimes wonder, is this something you're just
I do
telling
agree.
LPs?
I do agree, and it's simply driven by the fact that space businesses are typically very expensive, and so
Yeah.
you're looking for natural hedges towards big capital intensive bets, and defense is a capital intensive bet. You have low intensity sales cycles, you have long sales cycles. To win, defense procurements in space are usually very large, so program managers are making decisions that are high risk decisions. Nobody ever gets fired for the most part, by betting on Boeing or Lockheed or Northrop, delivering contracts to them. But if you're going to deliver a contract of that size to a startup, there's a different risk calculus from a program manager sitting in uniform. So investors know that, right? Investors have a sense of how long those sales cycles are, and they're looking for opportunities to sort of naturally hedge. And unfortunately, it's just not, I think that doesn't reflect what the actual opportunity is in defense today.
Do you agree that dual use is idiosyncratic, Tim? I thought that word was interesting.
You know, I do, and same thing on the investor paradigm is understanding how the government does business. It seems extremely complicated. It is. There's very high barriers to entry. You know, both Evan and I wore the uniform of our country for enough time, so we saw it from the other side. When you look at the programmatic side of business, most tech startups work their way, and about the 10 to 15 year point, they go, okay, now that we're out of the deals and the transactional, let's start focusing on how to get into programs. The space industry is the opposite. You start and you learn to play in the programmatic space. It is the most complex, most bespoke, longest sales cycle, but also with the same thing with a longer ROI. Mm-hmm. So it demands it. What we're focused on doing now, though, is to say, okay, we can productize capabilities. They don't all have to occupy that very expensive, tight corner of the financial curve and say, okay, we can bring the productization of capability. We talk about dual use. Let's talk about the other side of the dual use. As commercial is rapidly accelerating, passing, leading, and fortunately doing that, with the flag of the United States behind it, we then say, okay, how can we bring these capabilities responsibly to those companies as well? Once you are 100 miles above the earth, you are operating on the world stage. I don't care what country that is, but when you are operating in the space domain, any mistake that you make is done on the world stage, and it's very difficult to hide behind it. So as we're seeing emerging nations who are also looking for sovereign capability, the types of things that all three of us are doing are trying to make sure that they can responsibly participate in this domain as well.
Mm-hmm. Deborah, so how do you think about, in terms of startups' strategy, when to maybe lean further into defense or purely, I know with True Anomaly, as Evan described, versus starting early to get commercial customers?
Yeah, well, this is a tough one, and it is really a balance because certainly being able to show that there are, some commercial applications and successes there is really is one way to sort of build up your business and build up the business case. And I think we have seen successes. A company like an Anduril, of course, is their open software platform that does have commercial applications as well as military applications. But I think you have to be able to understand and get the right resources in to be able to help you with both markets, and and that's resource intensive. Because the timelines are more challenging. There's a regulatory component. Oftentimes there's more strict testing that's required in order to build that trust. Commercial is really more about that profit and getting things on the timelines. When you're working with government, there's just going to be some additional hurdles to have to work through. And so, I think a startup has to really think about, do they have that balance? Are they able to really try to pursue both of those at the same time? Do they have enough of the talent and workforce to do it? They may have to be able to shift and really focus on where they see that market. And if there isn't that clear commercial, then maybe they just go all in and really trying to work with these new DoD innovation programs and get that approach there. But it's a balance.
Mm-hmm. Evan, something that I've heard many times is that the winners are not going to be the companies that necessarily have the best technology, but the companies that can most effectively navigate the government. Would you agree?
I do agree with that. The sort of defense go-to-market strategy here that we have executed, and I don't want to speak in universals, but in terms of how we've executed, is we had a very strong view on the technology and the solution that needed to be developed to solve a very specific operational problem that my co-founders and I lived through. Well, sorry, is this cutting out? What we needed to do is go find a champion. We knew that we had plenty of champions in the operational community, but what we didn't have yet was a programmatic champion. So we went and we found that. And then the next day we went to the Hill and we argued for advocacy for programmed funding to align funding to that program. It required a congressional ad. It required a congressional ad over the course of 2 years. After we proved that we could build the technology using a variety of different program execution mechanisms, AFWorks, SpaceWorks, direct to phase 2, then ultimately at phase 3, we had the confidence that we could replicate that strategy over and over again. And what we've talked to is we've sort of fundraised over the last 12 months is when you're investing in a defense startup, you're not really investing in the tech. The tech is table stakes. The talent is table stakes. But what you have to master is a go-to-market strategy that starts with operational advocacy, clarity about the operational requirement, a right to solve that operational requirement unambiguously, a programmatic champion who's willing to stake their reputation and their ability to execute on your solution, advocacy within the Pentagon to align requirements, and then advocacy and funding alignment to bridge the gap between the 2-year POM cycle by having Congress flow funds to bridge that gap until you can get actual programmatic funding in the J-books to go execute. So one of the reasons the defense startups are so expensive, particularly in space, forget the capital intensive side of the space aspect, is you have to build a great tech team. That's the table stakes. Sometimes, I think you don't. If you have a great go-to-market strategy, we do. I'm not saying we have a great tech team, but you have to resource a GA motion, a government affairs motion, and a very talented, very robust sales team, and it just balloons your budget over the course of a couple of years.
Absolutely.
I have a follow-up for you, and I would also love to hear Tim's perspective on this question as well, because as Tim mentioned, both of you were in uniform. You were in the Space Force. You have a unique and intimate knowledge of the capabilities that it needs and maybe how to navigate some of the programs as you just laid out very succinctly. But there are people who don't have that background but would like to start selling to the government. Do you have any advice for them? They've never worked with the DoD before. They have not been in uniform. Is it like like you said, like the hires are very important, like business development?
Yeah, it's all after that. It's all business development.
Yeah.
Yeah, to get across the so-called valley of death, it's the tech, as you pointed out, is just not enough. So you can have brilliant tech, but often brilliant foundational tech for Department of Defense sales, for defense, is a point solution. You actually need to take a step back and have a broader thesis about operational requirements writ large for a particular domain. So it's sort of not enough to say, we're going to bring autonomy to surface vehicles, or we're going to bring autonomy to X, Y, and Z. You have to take a long view about the evolution of warfare, the evolution of the intersection of warfare and tech, and then you need to go find somebody that can establish trusted relationships. If you're not that person, establish trusted relationships across top to bottom. And there's a type. It's not, and apologies if this is a sort of potentially offensive to anybody. It's not your kind of 20-year Rolodex colonel that steps out of uniform one day and says that they can go get you deals. There's a completely different go-to-market skill set in the DoD that starts with relationships, but is much more nuanced than that.
I have to say I left as a major, so don't throw any shade at me.
Same. That's why I can say these things.
It's fascinating. What I would say is there's no secret sauce in having come from the military. What it does, though, is they do speak a different language, but where I would offer advice would be two things. Number one is focus on the mission, understand the mission. And then I think that aligns with what both my colleagues here were saying was don't come at a point solution. You're not trying to solve a thing, you're trying to support a mission. The second piece is many people in the industry are, I won't say afraid, but hesitant to give their opinion and have a level of discourse with the government. And remember, the regulatory requirements and the innovation is hampered by policy, is hampered by the FAR, the rules that the government puts in place to make sure that they're doing things the right way. We don't have that. We're able to bring innovation, conversations, again, in a very professional way, where we can say, hey, we might be able to get ahead of that requirement. We might be able to talk about what that next level of technology could do in support of your mission. And then lastly is you have to be willing to operate at the policy level. You have to say, I am going to participate in government affairs. I am going to go to the Hill. I'll give away a little bit of my. You're doing great. The piece that I will share with you is, I talk to our lead customers all the time. I'm going to the Hill. Here is the one pager I'm going to talk to this staff or this senator, this congresswoman about. Or we're going to go talk to this committee. I want you to see it. I want you to see what we're going to present. What can we do for you when we go there? I don't want there to be any visible light between what your expectations are and what we're planning on going to do, so that we can help in that. When I was wearing a uniform, going to the Hill was a horrible. It was like navigating a minefield. Also not fun, by the way. So what I would say is we're giving them an opportunity to share their requirements in a way where industry can help carry that water at the policy level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add here, your opening question was is the technology enough? And certainly it's the start, but as we've said here, you really have to be a startup thinking about what's a sustainable business. And so, we've talked here about the regulatory and the policy. And so I think having those advisors on that can really help you in building those relationships and building the trust and navigating it. And I think we need more of the innovative vehicles like the other transaction authorities. There's been some movement already, with Congress and with the IU to be able to make awards and be more flexible in the way they fund. I think to the future we need to see that continuation of more flexible funding and more changes here. We also, I think, ultimately the culture around the risk tolerance and the risk aversion needs to be changing. And I think the way you build those changes in the culture are through successes. So as we have more of these successes with these kinds of companies and can point to that, I think these are the other, I'll say, enabling ingredients on the, on the culture side, the way you think about risk and, being able to, build for sustainable business for the future.
Mm-hmm. Deborah, a few minutes ago, Evan brought up the Valley of Death. Is that still a concern, and how do you advise startups navigate that?
Certainly, absolutely, it is still the concern, and I think, the Valley of Death, we've talked about both on the technical side, but some of these other things on the regulatory, the policy, the funding, the gaps there. So I think, one of the things is, again, I do harken back to, if you will, the DoD innovation programs that are really trying to address some of this, and we're seeing that with the DIU and this Office of Strategic Capital. And I said something that we are really passionate about here at the Aerospace Corporation is kind of helping companies and new startups get through that and increase that TRL, tech readiness level, and do that tech maturation. And we have a very successful program right now, and we're really trying to see that the other government agencies expand that. The 7 companies now have been through this orbital prime, and they have access to subject matter experts at Aerospace and some of our autonomy labs and our experts here to be able to bring that maturation in the technologies. And NASA just signed a memorandum of understanding and agreement there with the Air Force to be able to take advantage of that. And that's really important. I had a conversation the other day with a startup CEO that said they had to do tests at one facility for one government agency and do the same tests within a week for a different government agency. And so I think, if we can think about tech readiness level and these tests and that verification for the government and get a little more acceptance across these, I think that can build in some efficiencies.
Mm-hmm. I want to briefly talk about investors and fundraising now. Evan, I know about a year ago, I suppose, True Anomaly closed its Series B, and you clearly have a very strong, sort of vision, and I want to hear from Slingshot also on this. It sounds like, particularly when you're working with the government, having an investor who will write you a check just maybe is not enough. You need an investor who also maybe understands the realities of selling to the DoD and maybe won't push a younger startup to make decisions that would maybe later harm their ability to work with the government. So how should a founder navigate those conversations with investors when they're fundraising, and what should they be looking out for? What's a red flag?
It's a great question, and so important to internalize as a startup founder and a member of the leadership team. We have spent I think one of the things we're really good at with our investors is educating our investors on defense. We brought on investors that had some experience. One in particular had a lot of experience, but others were just starting to formulate a defense thesis. And what's interesting is that if you look at a company like Anduril that has obviously made a massive splash and made it clear that defense is at least initially viable. I think we're all watching to see what happens in the next few years as Anduril continues to grow and potentially goes public. Whether the public markets treat that as ultimately a good investment, that will have downstream effects on the rest of the venture community and crossover investors. But I think we found a lot of investors, particularly in the Series A and Series B, were still at that nascent stage of understanding what defense was. They saw the headlines, everybody got excited about it, but ultimately didn't understand the real dynamics of defense investing, what it meant to go build a go-to-market strategy, and what the implications were for margins. Now, on the positive side of that, there was a very clear sort of reciprocal education around the margins that needed to exist in order to make True Anomaly a viable and interesting economic business. Very easy for me to get excited and focused on the mission, right? But at the end of the day, the balance sheet and dynamics of the business are what is going to drive us in the Series C and beyond. But you have to understand what you are really, really good at. And you have to be super clear about whether, particularly in the defense space, but at the intersection of space and defense, whether you're a space company or a defense company. We're a defense company. We're not a space company. We happen to build space products, but we're a defense company. That gets especially challenging when investors start to push the dual use thesis, because the economics and the timelines and the go-to-market strategy and the type of product and team that you have to go build to do defense, as we just talked about, is totally different. You're going to use that than like a SaaS play for a data play coming from space, and sure you can talk about that. they're different teams. They're totally different companies. It can dilute the focus, particularly at an early stage, and it just requires very open and honest conversations with investors and a very careful selection of who's around the table. Capital's not a commodity for either space or defense.
All right, I'll definitely take this one.
Okay.
I agree. I would say the people matter the most in that A and B level startup. I constantly pay homage to the co-founders of Slingshot Aerospace because they had a level of creativity and a vision for something that I get to, I'm allowed to lead this company now, but it's not something I could have done. So when you're looking at that early stage, and you're right, our typical VC portfolio is left and right coast, not heavy defense tech players. And they have to believe in you. They have to believe that you know what you're doing, that the team that you put in place knows how to navigate and can make the right decision how to pursue it. But there's a tug every day about the interesting in commercial. I mean, I'm sure all of us, our inboxes are full of investor from, they invested $5, so they would send you 5 articles. Why aren't you playing in this space? It's not what we do. Maintaining that focus is absolutely critical. This is what Slingshot Aerospace does. We do it well. We're in a pole position. How do we continue to innovate to maintain that and be able to deliver those timely solutions, cost effectively to a government that desperately needs them, right? In order to be able to do what the taxpayers are paying them to do. And so that's a privilege for us, but we are constantly like to say, are we on the right path? Are we heading in the right direction? This market gets more and more crowded thanks to folks like, Aerospace, where they're looking to bring more people in there. So watching people enter and look to disrupt, love that, right? I love to watch how people are looking to say, okay, you've created that, classic innovator's dilemma space, so we're going to go in and we're going to go after it. And they absolutely should, because that's the right thing to do for this industry. You opened by talking about how perhaps the funding or the focus wasn't necessarily right on space. Everybody sees what the threat looks like, everybody understands what the opportunity looks like, and the question is, how quickly can we get there? I would say that the pace of government is lagging the pace of what space demands right now. So we have an opportunity to help fill that and accelerate that, and investors are absolutely critical in allowing us to do it. I mean, I read articles or watch interviews all the time about, hey, the VC market's soft. Well, there's 2 places it isn't, space and defense, right? And at the intersection of those two, we're in a very good place. It is a high threshold for those investor dollars, and being able to tell that story, maintain that strategy, and have the people that can, follow through so that we can make, good returns for our investors, I think is important.
I think one of the messages of the panel so far has been that there's a risk of diluting your strategy, in Evan's words, if you pursue this sort of dual-use thesis. But is there, Deborah or Tim, is there a devil's advocate for the other position there that either of you would want to make before we close up? Because I'm sure there are many founders who are thinking, I actually do want to sell to commercial.
Yes, and I think, as it was stated, I mean, you have to be really clear about what your market and the business is. And so if you can bring in and develop some of that through commercial, I'd say go for it, right? I mean, it makes it stronger, and then you've done your proof points there for the government, and it's a kind of an easier transition. That may be a more straightforward path to go. So I think you have to really be intentional about that market and focused on, how are you going to get that business. But ultimately, I do resonate with the point, we need to go faster, and we need really both sets of these fundings to be able to support one another in there. And whether it's dual use or whether it's just, hey, understanding that VC money is important into defense and you're a defense company and that gets the government excited, I think all of those work, and we just really need to keep pressing and going, faster.
There are no clear, bright lines between commercial and government in space. So the dual use is upon us. There is no government only, right? Nobody is reading articles in the last year about what the government has done in space, right? It's Boeing, it's SpaceX, it's potential adversarial nations that are doing sovereign red versus blue activities in space. So we we do talk about supporting the mission. We do say that if we disagree in the use, we'll address that at the policy level, not at the mission level. But at the same time, there is incredible overlap. There are no defense-only or commercial-only operations out there right now. There is a lot of blend in there. So you have to be able to navigate both. And investors are constantly asking about, the mix of commercial revenue versus government revenue. And even sometimes that's hard to bifurcate.
Well, that is time. Deborah, Evan, and Tim, thank you so much for joining us on stage. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.